Imagine solving the greatest archaeological mystery of all time. We're not searching for a mythical lost continent, we're investigating a real Bronze Age civilization whose catastrophic destruction may have inspired Plato's famous story. Join us as we separate myth from history, examine the evidence, and reveal what Atlantis may have actually been. Stay with us through the end, because we're going to show you something incredible: how a real civilization, with advanced architecture, massive naval power, and sophisticated art, collapsed in a single catastrophic event that sent tsunamis across the Mediterranean. We'll examine Plato's original writings, explore the ruins of the civilization that matches his description, and reveal geological evidence that explains exactly what happened. By the end, you'll understand why this isn't speculation, it's detective work. And the truth is more fascinating than any myth. When most people hear Atlantis, they picture underwater crystal cities, ancient aliens, or lost advanced technology. From Plato to Disney, from New Age mystics to History Channel documentaries, Atlantis has become a cultural phenomenon. But here's the problem: almost everything you think you know about Atlantis comes from sources written thousands of years after Plato, or from pure imagination. The modern Atlantis myth was built by authors like Ignatius Donnelly in 1882, who claimed Atlantis was the origin of all civilization, and Edgar Cayce, who said it was in the Bahamas and housed alien technology. None of this appears in the original text. So what did Plato say? The only ancient sources for Atlantis are two dialogues written by Plato around 360 BCE, the Timaeus and the Critias. That's it. No earlier source exists. Before Plato, there was no Atlantis. In these texts, Plato describes how the Athenian statesman Solon visited Egypt around 590 BCE, where priests at the temple of Sais told him an ancient story. They claimed that 9,000 years earlier, around 9600 BCE in Plato's timeline, a powerful island empire existed beyond the Pillars of Hercules, what we call the Strait of Gibraltar. This empire, they said, was larger than Libya and Asia combined. Its capital featured concentric rings of land and water, massive canals, orichalcum-covered walls, a harbor full of triremes, and a confederation of 10 kings descended from the god Poseidon. The island had abundant resources, including elephants, and commanded a vast navy of 1,200 ships. Then, after the Atlanteans became corrupt and waged war against Athens and Egypt, the gods punished them. Quote, "Violent earthquakes and floods occurred, and in a single day and night of misfortune, the island of Atlantis disappeared into the depths of the sea." Most classical scholars treat Atlantis as Plato's literary invention, a philosophical allegory, not history. Why? First, the timeline makes no sense. 9,000 years before Solon would be 9,600 BCE, deep in the Stone Age, long before writing, cities, or naval empires. Second, Plato describes triremes, dockyards, and military organization that match his own 4th century BCE Greece, not prehistoric civilization. It's anachronistic, like describing cavemen with aircraft carriers. Third, Plato was writing philosophy, not history. The Atlantis story appears in dialogues exploring ideal governments and moral decline. Athens represents the good republic, Atlantis, the corrupted one. It's a cautionary tale. But here's where it gets interesting. Why include such specific, vivid details if it's pure invention? Why set it in Egypt's past? Why describe a catastrophic destruction that sounds like a natural disaster? What if Plato, or his source, Solon, had heard an Egyptian memory of a real catastrophe, and then adapted it into his philosophical parable? The 9,000-year date is Plato's biggest problem. But what if it's wrong, not because Plato lied, but because something was lost in translation? Some scholars propose that Egyptian scribes used a different counting system, and when Solon translated the story into Greek, he misunderstood the numbers. What if the Egyptian priest said 900 years, not 9,000? That would place the event around 1500 BCE, the height of the Bronze Age, when advanced civilizations did exist in the Mediterranean. And in 1600 BCE, something catastrophic happened in that exact region. Something that involved an island, a palace civilization, earthquakes, and destruction in what ancient sources described as a single day and night. But here's where it gets strange: Plato included one detail that makes no sense, unless he was describing something real. Let's forensically examine what Plato actually wrote, because the details matter. Plato says Atlantis was in front of the Pillars of Hercules, the Strait of Gibraltar. He calls the Mediterranean only a harbor compared to the true ocean beyond the straits, and describes an opposite continent across the Atlantic. Most people stop here and think, Atlantic Ocean, therefore Atlantis must be in the Atlantic. But Plato also says the island controlled regions within the straits, meaning inside the Mediterranean. He describes its influence over Libya, Egypt, and the Aegean. That's odd. If Atlantis was far out in the Atlantic, why does its empire extend into the Mediterranean? Unless, what if beyond the pillars didn't mean geographically westward, but politically, beyond the reach of Greek civilization? What if it meant from outside the known world rather than a precise location? Here's the key: Plato is writing for a Greek audience who sees the Mediterranean as the center of civilization. An island power attacking from beyond the pillars signals an external, foreign threat, not a map coordinate. Plato's description of the capital city is extraordinarily specific. He describes concentric rings of land and water, 2 rings of land, 3 rings of water, created by the god Poseidon to protect his mortal lover Cleito. The rings were connected by a canal from the sea, 50 stadia long, about 9 kilometers, allowing ships to sail from the ocean into the inner harbors. Bridges and roofed passages crossed the water rings. The outermost wall was covered in brass, the next in tin, and the innermost in orichalcum, a reddish metal that flashed like fire. The harbor was full of triremes, Greek warships, and naval stores. The plain surrounding the city was enormous, 3,000 by 2,000 stadia, or roughly 555 by 370 kilometers, crisscrossed by a grid of irrigation canals. Plato even gives military details. The plain was divided into 60,000 lots, each required to provide soldiers and sailors, amounting to an army in the hundreds of thousands and a navy of 1,200 ships. Why would Plato invent such precise logistical details for a fictional allegory? These numbers sound like someone describing a real place, or at least, a place based on something real. And then comes the destruction. Plato says that after Athens defeated the Atlantean invasion, the gods punished both sides. Quote, "But afterwards there occurred violent earthquakes and floods, and in a single day and night of misfortune, all your warlike men in a body sank into the earth, and the island of Atlantis in like manner disappeared in the depths of the sea." A single day and night. Earthquakes and floods. The island disappeared into the depths. This doesn't sound like a military defeat or gradual decline. This sounds like a natural disaster. Specifically, it sounds like a volcanic eruption. Plato adds one more detail: after Atlantis sank, the sea became impassable because of shoals of mud where the island once stood. Ancient sailors, he says, could no longer navigate that area. Mud shoals after an island vanishes. That detail is oddly specific. And it matches something geologists know happens after certain types of volcanic eruptions, when massive amounts of pumice and ash settle in the water, creating hazardous shallows. So where did Plato get this story? He explicitly credits Egyptian priests. In the dialogue, the Egyptian priest tells Solon, "You Greeks are like children. You have no ancient tradition, no knowledge hoary with age, because you have suffered many destructions. But in Egypt, we keep records of such things." The priest claims Egypt preserves memories of ancient catastrophes because Egyptian civilization is older and more stable than Greece. He says the Atlantis War happened 9,000 years before Solon's visit, around 9,600 BCE by Plato's count. But what if Egypt did preserve a memory of a real catastrophe, just not one from 9600 BCE? What if Egyptian records contained stories of a powerful island civilization in the Mediterranean that was destroyed by earthquakes and floods around 1500 BCE? We know Egypt had extensive contact with the Aegean in the Bronze Age. Egyptian tomb paintings depict Keftiu, a people scholars identify as Minoans from Crete, bringing tribute. Egyptian records from the 15th century BCE mention disruptions in the Mediterranean. What if Solon heard an Egyptian memory of the Minoans, the Bronze Age superpower of the Aegean, and their catastrophic collapse? And then, in 1967, archaeologists uncovered something that changed everything. In the Bronze Age, from roughly 2000 to 1450 BCE, the island of Crete was home to Europe's first great civilization, the Minoans. The Minoans weren't just sophisticated, they were revolutionary. They built massive multi-story palaces with indoor plumbing, flushing toilets, and advanced drainage systems. They created vibrant frescoes depicting dolphins, bull leaping, and nature scenes. They dominated Aegean trade, controlling sea routes from Egypt to the Greek mainland. Their capital at Knossos was a sprawling complex covering 20,000 square meters, a palace so intricate that later Greeks would remember it as the legendary labyrinth of King Minos, home of the Minotaur. The Minoans were a naval power. They built ships, established colonies throughout the Aegean, and traded luxury goods, gold, ivory, saffron, fine pottery, across the Mediterranean. Egyptian pharaohs received Minoan ambassadors. In other words, the Minoans were an advanced island civilization with monumental architecture, sophisticated culture, and naval dominance, just like Plato's Atlantis. Now we travel 70 miles north of Crete, to the island of Thera, today called Santorini. In 1967, Greek archaeologist Spiridon Marinatos began excavating a site called Akrotiri on Thera's southern coast. What he found astonished the world. Buried under meters of volcanic ash was an entire Bronze Age city, perfectly preserved. Multi-story buildings with elaborate frescoes. Sophisticated plumbing. Storage jars filled with food. Furniture, pottery, tools, all frozen in time. It was like Pompeii, but 1,500 years older. The frescoes at Akrotiri are breathtaking. One shows a fleet of ships sailing between towns in a ceremonial procession, evidence of maritime culture. Another depicts fishermen holding strings of fresh catch. There are images of young boxers, swallows in springtime, antelopes. But here's what's haunting: no human remains. No bodies. No skeletons. The people of Akrotiri had time to evacuate before disaster struck. Because what buried this city wasn't an enemy army. It was one of the largest volcanic eruptions in human history. Around 1600 BCE, the island of Thera erupted. This wasn't a normal eruption. This was one of the most violent volcanic explosions in human history, a volcanic explosivity index 7 event, the same category as the 1815 eruption of Mount Tambora, which caused the year without a summer and global climate disruption. To put this in perspective, the Thera eruption was roughly 4 times more powerful than Krakatoa in 1883, and vastly larger than Vesuvius in 79 CE. The eruption followed a sequence. First, a massive Plinian column, a vertical eruption shooting ash and pumice 36 kilometers into the atmosphere. Tephra blanketed the region. Then, as seawater flooded into the magma chamber, phreatomagmatic explosions ripped the island apart. Pyroclastic flows, superheated avalanches of gas and rock traveling at hundreds of kilometers per hour, raced across the landscape. Finally, the island's center collapsed, forming the caldera we see today. Where a mountain once stood, there's now a bay 400 meters deep. The eruption ejected an estimated 60 cubic kilometers of rock, enough to bury London under 10 meters of ash. Volcanic ash rained down across the eastern Mediterranean. Marine sediment cores from the Aegean, the Black Sea, and even the Nile Delta contain layers of the Ran tephra. And then came the tsunamis. When a volcanic island collapses into the sea, it displaces unimaginable amounts of water. The Thera eruption generated massive tsunamis that radiated across the Mediterranean. At Palikastro, on the northeastern coast of Crete, geologists found a chaotic deposit layer, a jumble of volcanic ash, seashells, building debris, and pottery, buried inland. Analysis suggests a tsunami at least 9 meters high struck the coast. At Malea, on Crete's northern shore, researchers discovered marine sediments up to 400 meters inland, deposited by a massive wave. Computer models estimate waves reach 12 to 15 meters on the north coast of Crete. Tsunami deposits have been identified in Turkey, the Levant, and possibly even Egypt. Ancient sources speak of disruptions in the Nile Delta during this period, unusual flooding events that some scholars tentatively link to the Thera eruption. Imagine the scene: a Bronze Age port city on Crete, bustling with trade. Suddenly, the ground shakes. The sea withdraws, exposing the harbor floor. Then, a wall of water, 3-4 stories high, roars inland, smashing buildings, flooding fields, drowning everything in its path. This happened across the Aegean, in a single day. So did the Thera eruption destroy Minoan civilization? It's more complicated than that. The eruption didn't end the Minoans immediately. Archaeological evidence shows that Minoan culture continued after the eruption. Palaces were rebuilt, pottery styles evolved, trade resumed. But the eruption delivered a catastrophic blow. Coastal settlements were devastated by tsunamis. Ashfall ruined crops across Crete. The Minoan fleet may have been destroyed in harbor. Trade networks were disrupted. And around 1450 BCE, about 150 years after the eruption, Minoan palaces across Crete were destroyed in a wave of violence. Knossos was taken over by Mycenaean Greeks from the mainland. Linear A, the Minoan script, was replaced by Linear B, an early form of Greek. The Minoan civilization effectively ended. Did the Thera eruption weaken the Minoans enough that they fell to invasion? Did it trigger societal collapse? We don't know for sure. But the sequence is clear: a powerful island civilization, a catastrophic volcanic eruption, tsunamis, and collapse. A civilization swallowed by the sea, in what survivors would remember as a single day and night of disaster. Before we conclude, there's one more theory we need to address, and it's the wildest of all. Some researchers propose that Atlantis was Tartessos, a wealthy trading kingdom in southwest Spain, near modern-day Cadiz, right by the Pillars of Hercules. Tartessos was real. Ancient sources mention it as a rich, metal trading polity that dealt with Phoenicians and Greeks in the 9th to 6th centuries BCE. Recent archaeology has uncovered impressive sites in the region. So why isn't Tartessos Atlantis? Several reasons. First, Tartessos was on the mainland, not an island. Second, it existed in the Iron Age centuries after Plato's adjusted timeline and long after the Minoan collapse. Third, Tartessos didn't vanish in a catastrophic flood, it declined gradually due to economic and political changes. Most importantly, classical archaeologists explicitly reject the Tartessos-Atlantis connection as pseudo-archaeological. One excavator said, "There is no serious evidence linking Tartessos to Plato's Atlantis, it's a conflation driven by geographic proximity, not facts." Another popular theory claims Atlantis was the Richat structure in Mauritania, West Africa, a massive circular geological formation nicknamed the Eye of the Sahara. From space, the Richat looks like a bullseye, concentric rings spanning 45 kilometers across. Some claim it matches Plato's description of Atlantis's ringed capital. There's one problem: geology. The Richat structure is an eroded geologic dome, layers of sedimentary and igneous rock exposed by millions of years of erosion. It's not a submerged city, it's a natural rock formation. It's also 500 kilometers inland from the Atlantic Ocean, in the middle of the Sahara Desert. Plato explicitly says Atlantis was an island that sank into the sea, leaving muddy shoals. The Richat is neither an island, nor in the ocean, nor submerged. This theory requires ignoring everything Plato wrote about Atlantis's location, destruction, and maritime nature. Other theories place Atlantis in the Bahamas, based on the Bimini Road, a linear formation of rectangular stones underwater near Bimini Island. Proponents claim it's an ancient paved road. Geologists have studied Bimini Road extensively. It's beach rock, natural coastal limestone that fractures into rectangular blocks. Cores drilled through the blocks show consistent stratification, proof they formed in place, not as quarried construction. Radiocarbon dating puts the formation at 2,000 to 4,000 years old, far too recent for Plato's timeline, even adjusted. Then there's Antarctica. Some claim Atlantis is buried under Antarctic ice, and that the Piri Reis map from 1513 shows an ice-free Antarctic coastline, proving an ancient advanced civilization mapped it. This doesn't hold up. Antarctica has been ice-covered for millions of years. The supposed match between the Piri Reis map and Antarctica's coastline is retrofitting, drawing the map at a convenient angle and scale until it vaguely resembles the continent. These theories exemplify pseudo-archaeology, starting with a conclusion: Atlantis was real and advanced, then cherry-picking or misinterpreting evidence to support it, while ignoring geology, dating, and the actual text. Why do so many fringe theories attach themselves to Atlantis? Because Atlantis represents a powerful narrative, the lost golden age, the advanced ancient civilization, the hidden knowledge waiting to be rediscovered. It feeds into a desire to believe that the past was more mysterious and magical than conventional history allows. Pseudo-archaeology thrives on Atlantis because Plato left just enough ambiguity, and just enough vivid detail, to let people project their own fantasies onto the story. You can place Atlantis anywhere if you're willing to ignore Plato's timeline, geography, and context. But the truth is more interesting than fantasy. The Minoans were real. The Thera eruption was real. The Bronze Age collapse was real. We don't need aliens or lost continents to make history fascinating. Let's talk about how myths are made. Imagine you're an Egyptian priest in 590 BCE, the year Solon visits your temple. You have records, written and oral, of catastrophes that struck the Mediterranean centuries earlier. You know of a powerful island civilization to the north that was destroyed by earthquakes and floods. You know the sea rose and swallowed cities. You know trade networks collapsed. But it's been 1,000 years. Details have faded. Names have changed. The timeline is hazy. So when you tell Solon the story, you round the numbers, many thousands of years ago, because that's how you convey ancient beyond memory. Solon takes the story back to Athens and retells it. Maybe he embellishes. Maybe he misremembers. Maybe Greek and Egyptian counting systems don't perfectly align. Decades later, Plato hears the story from Solon's descendants. And Plato, a philosopher, not a historian, adapts it into a dialogue exploring political corruption and divine punishment. He adds literary flourishes. He structures it as allegory. By the time we read Plato's Atlantis, we're reading a story that's been translated, transmitted, and transformed over 1,000 years and across 3 cultures. Catastrophic events scar cultural memory. The eruption of Thera and the collapse of the Minoans would have reverberated across the Mediterranean for generations. Egyptian scribes recorded unusual Nile floods. Hittite records speak of disruptions. Greek myths remember Crete as a place of lost grandeur, King Minos, the Labyrinth, the Minotaur. These aren't literal histories, they're mythologized memories. Over centuries, oral traditions compress events. A century-long decline becomes a single day. Multiple disasters merge into one cataclysm. Real places become mythical lands. We do this with our own history. The sinking of Titanic in 1912 became a myth about hubris and class. The world wars are remembered through symbols and slogans that flatten complexity. 9/11 has already become a myth. Younger generations, who weren't there, know it through stories, images, and reconstructed narratives. Atlantis is no different. A real civilization met a real disaster. Over a millennium, that disaster became legend. And Plato, 1,200 years later, turned the legend into philosophy. We need to understand that Plato was a philosopher, not a historian. His goal wasn't to document the past, it was to teach through story. In the Timaeus and Critias, Atlantis serves a philosophical purpose. Athens, in Plato's telling, was a perfect republic ruled by philosopher guardians, the ideal he championed in the Republic. Atlantis was Athens's opposite, a wealthy, powerful empire corrupted by greed and ambition, eventually punished by the gods. The story teaches that virtue matters more than power. That moral decline leads to destruction. That even the mightiest civilization can fall if it loses its ethical foundation. Plato didn't care if Atlantis was historically accurate. He cared if it was philosophically true. But, and this is the fascinating part, he grounded his allegory in something that sounded real. He invoked Egypt, a civilization older and more stable than Greece. He used specifics, dates, distances, architectural details. He made it feel historical so the lesson would land harder. In doing so, he may have woven in threads of a real catastrophe, Minoan Crete and the Thera eruption, and transformed them into timeless parable. The final lesson of Atlantis is that we still do this. We still mythologize our own history. We simplify. We dramatize. We turn nuanced events into clean narratives with heroes and villains. We compress timelines and forget details. And future generations will inherit our myths, not knowing what was real and what was embellishment. The debate over Atlantis isn't just about an ancient story. It's about how we remember the past, and how the past, once lost, becomes whatever we need it to be. But archaeology and geology give us tools Plato didn't have. We can excavate Akrotiri and see the frescoes. We can carbon date volcanic ash. We can model tsunami wave heights. We can read linear A and linear B. We can compare texts and sediment layers and DNA. And when we do that, the real story emerges. The Minoans were a sophisticated island civilization destroyed by a catastrophic volcanic eruption. That story reached Egypt, where it was preserved in temple records. Solon heard it and brought it home. Plato adapted it. Atlantis, as Plato described it, never existed. But something real inspired the legend. And the truth, the Minoans, the Thera eruption, the tsunamis, the collapse, is more fascinating than any myth. So let's bring it all together. Plato wrote about Atlantis around 360 BCE, claiming an Egyptian source. Most scholars treat it as allegory, a philosophical tale, not history. And they're right, Atlantis, as Plato described it, is fiction. But the Minoan Thera hypothesis gives us the most evidence-based explanation for what may have inspired the legend. Around 1600 BCE, the Minoan civilization, a sophisticated island culture dominating the Aegean, was devastated by the Thera volcanic eruption, one of the largest in human history. Tsunamis struck Crete. Cities were destroyed. The Minoan world never fully recovered, collapsing completely by 1450 BCE. Egyptian records preserved memories of catastrophes in the Mediterranean. When Solon visited Egypt in 590 BCE, priests may have shared those memories. Over centuries, the story was retold, embellished, and mythologized until Plato adapted it into the Atlantis we know. The timeline is wrong. The location is approximate. The details are exaggerated. But the core, a powerful island civilization destroyed by earthquake and flood in a day and night, fits the Minoan collapse. Atlantis isn't fiction or history. It's both, a myth built on the bones of something real. If you found this investigation fascinating, check out our other episodes exploring ancient mysteries with evidence-based rigor. Subscribe to Underlight Histories for more deep dives into archaeology, lost civilizations, and the real science behind ancient mysteries. We separate myth from history, so you can decide what's real. Thanks for watching. See you in the next investigation.